There are a few topics we cover on this podcast on a fairly regular basis, and we're going to talk about them all today. Disinformation and the propagation of damaging untruths. Media and science literacy, which helps people make informed decisions about what's best for them. And more than anything, I like to think we're translating and mobilizing knowledge. What is this research really saying? How can it be used to improve the lives of Canadians and people around the world? My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications person at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. In the past few years, we've talked about innovative ways to bring psychological knowledge to more people in an evidence-based way. Dr. Jen Vrend, Dr. Layla Din Osman, and Dr. Mary Simmering McDonald created the child psychology podcast, The Coping Toolbox. Recently, we've spoken with Madeline Springle, whose YouTube channel, Master Your Interview, helps people nail video interviews. And Summer Knight, who's already put her knowledge to great use by publishing the children's book, Today is a Rainy Day Before Even Graduating, with her PhD. Today, we're going to be speaking with a psychologist who's been doing just that, writing evidence-based children's books for well over a decade.
Hello, I'm Jillian Roberts. I'm a research professor at the University of Victoria and a registered psychologist and the founder of the Mindkey Health clinics. So I'm registered in British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories.
And you are a rather prolific children's book author as well. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. You've got a new book coming out, all about helping kids make friends. Tell me about the new book.
Well, thank you. Just a little bit of background for fellow psychologists out there. We understand the incredible importance of social development and social skills and friendships and that sense of belonging for children. It's a powerful protective factor. So when we think about Anne Maston's resilience theory, there are things that we can do that help buffer children, so allow them to bounce back from challenges or navigate challenges so that they have the best possible outcome. And social skills is one of the most powerful protective factors for kids. And over COVID, of course, many children were socially isolated. For children who were the only child in a family, for a very extensive period of time, they only had adults to interact with. And for young children, many lost the opportunity to go to preschool or kindergarten, where many of those foundational social skills are practiced and developed. On the coming out of COVID, principal, a friend of mine, and I had lunch, and he was explaining that they were observing that the children had delayed social skills and just sort of meant to be kind of funny. You should write a book about that, Jill. Like, this is your, you've written so many books. Why don't you write a book about this? And so this is, I think, my 13th children's book. And I took that idea and ran with it.
I'm thinking it must be for much younger children, right? Slightly older children over the course of the pandemic started to make friends online, and they interacted online, and then it became a sort of difficult transition for them to go back into meeting people in person and some of those social skills. But for very young children, they wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that, I imagine. Is that something you touch on in the book? I
don't exactly touch on like the pandemic, and the book is actually written for the child. So it's like designed for like 6 to 8 year olds or maybe 5 to 9 year olds, depending on the developmental level of the child. So elementary school children and like young elementary school children. So it's a picture book. But what I'm trying to accomplish with the book is creating a solid foundation for the child upon which they would build good friendship skills over time. So just to take it a couple of steps back, I've been working with children for over 30 years. So before I was a psychologist, I was an elementary school teacher and a special ed teacher, an inclusive education teacher. Then I went back to graduate school and I became a psychologist in 1998. So it's been a very long period of time that I've been working frontline with children. And throughout this time, I've coined something that I call the number one friendship rule. So if children are struggling socially and I get a chance to see them and work with them, I start with this concept. Oh, friendships are tough. I remember when I was young, friendships were really tough. Lots of people actually find friendships tough. And you want to know why? It's because they haven't yet learned the number one friendship rule. So has anybody told you about that? And then it just sort of continues into the number one friendship rule is if you want to have friends, you must first be a good friend. And then the conversation becomes, what does being a good friend look like? And so that's the opening also of this book. And then I go into what does being a good friend look like? But what I had found is that traditional social skills programs that I have access to, that we all have access to, seem to be focused mostly on kid etiquette. So by that, I mean, a good one is your personal space, and it's sort of like your hand distance apart from other people is kind of your bubble, so like many of the social skills programs out there are based on kind of these micro skills, which, by the way, I think are really important. But before we get to that, though, like it's important for kids to understand, what does being a good friend look like? So that's how I've centered the book, and I build from there. And then, after working with this book, I think all the other traditional social skills programs that we have access to would make a lot more sense for the child.
And so what does being a good friend look like? Certainly at that age, I think some of us have a sense as we become adults what being a good friend looks like. Many of us don't. Building on that from a very young age, what does it look like for a 6-year-old?
Yes. So I think one of the most important things for all psychologists is to understand that we can't just sort of dumb down adult stuff and think that it's going to work for kids, right? Like what we absolutely must do when we're working with children is we need to think about developmental stages and, Piaget's developmental stages and just think, okay, where are children developmentally right now? They need things concrete, it can't be too abstract, right? So we need to think in terms of what they would understand. So by making it a rule, children this age are very rule oriented, but then also like how can we phrase it so that they understand? So the very first concept in the book, outside of the number one friendship rule, is that being a good friend means that you think about other people, not just yourself. So it's not that you think of other people over yourself, but you think of other people and what they want and what they need, not just yourself. And so if you get this idea of, it's almost like theory of mind or perspective taking, it requires a significant amount of awareness, self-awareness, which is hard for children this age, but it's an important skill to start building because, of course, it's what empathy is built on. So we start with the idea that being a good friend means that you're thinking of other people, not just yourself. And then it goes into kind of some kid etiquette around that, like sharing and taking turns, doing things or playing what other kids want, not just what you want. So around not being bossy. So we start off with this concept of, practicing seeing a play situation from the other child's perspective.
I imagine this is designed as well to be some sort of foundation going forward, right? If you develop these skills at a very young age, then presumably you carry them with you as you grow older. And as they're obviously still relevant when you're 11 years old or 15 years old, right?
Yeah, it's funny, that I wrote the book for little ones, but I'm learning that a lot of people are actually buying it for lots of different ages as a little instruction booklet for life kind of thing, but for lots of different ages, because I think that the concepts, of course, transcend, right? They transcend just little ones. But if little ones can develop these concepts and values, establish these values inside of themselves, when they're young, of course, we understand that children's schemas are still developing at this stage. Nothing is hardwired yet, right? Everything, all the neural pathways are still in play, if you will, like they're still forming and developing. So if we can really reinforce these concepts to little ones, it will be sort of the foundation of their moral compass as they continue to grow up and further develop. So absolutely, it's something that I think all of us can work on. As the book continues, I talk about concepts like understanding the difference between right and wrong, but in there, it's like, good friends help each other be the best possible versions of themselves, right? So you're not going to want to kind of encourage a child to do something that's wrong, and then if something has been done that's wrong, how to take accountability for it and say sorry and offer forgiveness. Being a good friend is about also helping the other person be a good friend and being a good person. And if you have some influence over the other person, can you help them make the best decisions? So it's sort of like there's this social psychology concept embedded within the book as well.
You've done obviously a lifetime of research in this subject. One of the things that we've talked about a fair amount in the last couple of weeks on this podcast is knowledge mobilization. Yes. And this idea that, it's difficult sometimes for people to find interesting or useful venues that can reach a larger audience so that the science that you're doing is actually helping people, that is designed to help. Is that one of the motivations? I mean, you said this is your 13th children's book. You've been doing this for a long time. Talk to me about it in terms of knowledge mobilization. I mean, a series of children's books on a number of different subjects, all based on the research that you've done in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a research professor. I'm a full professor at the University of Victoria. I've been at UVic since 1999. And early on in my career, I mean, I've been at UVic for decades now. But early on, I was a very traditional professor, applying for external grants and, writing journal articles and going to conferences and, like very typical, but sort of, I don't know, like 10 years in, it didn't feel as rewarding. And it also felt like I'd always maintained a little private practice, which of course then, bloomed into Mindkey Health, which has 55 employees. But I always maintained a private practice. And there was just this great big kind of cleft or this schism between what I was doing in the university and what I was doing in clinic. And it felt disjointed. So I made a decision that I was not only going to do traditional outputs. I mean, I still do traditional outputs. I'm going to be guest editing an issue this year for the Canadian Journal of School Psychology, and I've had grants and I published just another journal article a couple of weeks ago. So I do still do traditional publishing, but not like I used to. So I mean, I've got, of course, a column in the Globe and Mail, and which is all centered around psychology. And then I write children's books. And these are my attempts to translate, really. So it is mobilization for sure, but there's also a component here of translation. So how do we distill the wisdom of our field into messages or information that can be readily used and made useful by our community? So thinking about, like synthesizing and distilling things in a way that can be consumed. And so consuming for the general population, which is what I try to do in my Globe and Mail column, is one set of difficulty, and then distilling it even further so that it is consumable for kids is like another level of difficulty. But when you can nail it, like when you can absolutely nail it, like where you keep on working, you keep on like iterating and like making the ideas more simple and more simple and more simple, and then you build a story around it, right?
I mean, that's how I'm thinking about it too. Our last podcast was with Madeline Springle. She's a student at the University of Calgary, and she started a YouTube channel based on her specific field of research, which is one-way video interviews. So you have to interview for a job, and you're doing a video that you create yourself and upload to the platform that's your response to the interview question. It's, I mean, very niche, but it's certainly her YouTube channel is going to help the people who are doing that very specific thing. But she is translating it for adults who are going into job interviews. And I imagine the Globe and Mail column that you write is geared toward adults because 6-year-olds don't read the Globe and Mail. And, you have to subscribe to it. We also have had some psychologists on this podcast who do a podcast of their own. It's called The Coping Toolbox. And Lila Din Osman and two of her colleagues do this podcast here in Ottawa. And but that's, again, geared toward parents of children who are going to listen to a podcast and then maybe use some of the strategies that they provide there, right? It's a way to get the message out to a larger audience, distill it. But like you said, right, writing something specifically for children must add another level of difficulty. And I think in the conversations I've had with people who are trying to figure out knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, that the more simple you make something, the more frightening it becomes because you're getting away from all the nuance that goes into the research in the first place. I'm going to simplify this so children can understand it, but that means I'm taking out these components of this research that may actually be very important. And if I were peer reviewed, I'd have a hard time with it, that kind of thing. Does that sort of thing go through your head? Is simplifying it the most difficult part of that process?
Well, yes, simplifying it is absolutely the most difficult part of the process. But there comes some freedom with having done this for 30 years, right? So like in my pre-tenure time or even pre-promotion time, I was very worried and concerned about all of that. But I consider myself probably one of the most senior child psychologists in our country. And I feel I have some responsibility to share what I've learned, but also to, pave the way for other people that want to disseminate in novel and innovative ways, right? So like I did experience challenges at the University of Victoria with people not accepting children's books as publications. I had a colleague stand right up and argue when we were doing unit standards that she didn't believe that children's books should count as a publication. Yes, there is challenges with deviating and not being able to provide citations for everything and sort of ground all your ideas into the larger, extant literature. You can't do that. You can't do that sort of debit trail of your ideas, so it makes sense to another psychologist.
Right. Like no one's going to do a study later on that cites the Friendship Guide as one of the, books that they've read that led to their study, right?
Right. Or for me to give, and when I'm writing the book and I'm presenting these different ideas, I don't get to give citations in the children's book of where I got, what research this is all connected to, right? But I'm at the stage, I think, in my career now where it doesn't really matter. For me, I should be less concerned about what other people are thinking about me and my work. It shouldn't be about them. It should be whatever energy I've got left in this career of mine, I should be trying to give it back to the community in the best way that I possibly can. And I'm geared towards this kind of work. It comes naturally for me. So it makes sense to play upon my own strengths in this way. So it's a bit of a paradigm shift, but I know that that's very difficult for new clinicians and new scholars. I get that there's risk with that. So when I hear about, bright young students doing YouTube channels, it just fills me with such hope because it's exciting to think about them getting to a place of innovation far earlier than I did myself.
And I think there's got to be a bit of a paradigm shift to encourage that innovation at a younger age, at an earlier stage in their careers. One of the podcasts we did very recently was with Summer Knight, who's a student at University of Ottawa, who's written her own children's book called Today is a Rainy Day. And it's about a Black family that's dealing with a number of issues, including, depression in one of the children and how the siblings respond to it and that sort of thing. And it's, something she's obviously brought from her own personal experiences and also from the learning that she's done in school and the knowledge that she's able to accumulate over that short period of time in school. So right from the beginning, finding a way to go directly to the people who might be most affected by it.
Well, I also think there's like emotional literacy that comes with that too, right? The more that we can have children become self-aware and understand and communicate the emotional experiences that they are having, the better the adults in their life are going to be able to help them, right? So if we don't talk about emotions, or we don't make emotions okay to talk about, or we don't make it okay to talk about struggling to make a friend, or struggling to resolve a conflict with a friend, or feeling lonely, or not knowing how to navigate asking to join a friendship group, right? Like if we don't make it okay to talk about these things, if we don't normalize these conversations, children are navigating it by themselves. And, they don't have to, there's lots of things that we can share with kids that will make it easier for them to navigate those things. And the stronger socially, the stronger interpersonally, the stronger self-awareness and emotional awareness that young people have, the better able they are going to be to adapt to this, rapidly changing world of ours.
Yeah, you mentioned emotional literacy. One of the things that I talk about a lot on this podcast is media literacy and how we need to start teaching young people at a very young age how to discern good information from bad information, evidence-based solutions from, sort of quackery. And have you considered actually putting in citations in your children's books so that children learn at a very young age to look for citations? And then, I'm joking.
That's it. No, it's interesting. I've written one parenting book. I found it a grueling process. I don't think I want to write parent books again. It just was so long and hard, and harder than writing a textbook, I found. And it had citations, of course. What I do have in almost all of my books is at the very back of the book, the last couple of pages, I put resources for teachers and parents. So this particular book talks about social skills within the overall framework of resilience theory, and it gives activities that can be done at home and school that would, the parents could, or the teacher could use the book as a launch point and do different activities that help to reinforce different concepts in the book. I think it's really important, evidence-based approaches to child psychology, I think are incredibly important. I'll give a couple of really important examples. When I started in this field, there was a lot of talk about letting kids just cry it out. You let babies cry it out, you let people cry it out. If you give them too much attention, it's going to reinforce them crying again in the future. Well, that hasn't panned out, right? We know that it's not true. If a child is emotionally triggered and they go into an extreme emotional distress and a tantrum, we run the risk of their brain being conditioned to do that. Emotional trigger, tantrum, right? So we know that children need help to regulate, right from the very beginning. Think of Cicchetti's work, right from the very beginning. We need to be helping children. We need to be modeling for them self-regulation strategies. And Dan Siegel's more recent work has talked about the importance of co-regulation. So kids, when they have big emotions, that's scary for them. And if we're sending them outside the classroom door, into a corner, into a timeout chair, they're having to experience all of those big emotions all by themselves. Whereas, Dan Siegel talks about see and soothe. We need to see the child and help soothe them, deeply see and understand them, and then help soothe them. So these are just a couple of examples where if we just kind of let the general public kind of extrapolate science themselves, right? We run into risks, right? So, somebody thought about behaviorism and thought about this thing about conditioning kids, and we're going to let them cry it out, right? Well, that was not helpful, right?
Right.
Right. Timeout chairs or sending kids into the hall was not helpful. And that was a standard practice in many, many, many schools for many, many, many years. And I think it probably still is occurring in many, many schools.
It definitely happened to me.
Yeah. So we have such an amazing and incredible field. Like, the field of psychology is magical in many ways in terms of the wisdom and the insight that it gives us, and navigating the principles of psychology and helping so that they make sense to someone who doesn't have our training is incredibly important, because otherwise people can run with something taken out of context and can do harm with that, right? So part of knowledge translation is a responsibility to make sure that our field is understood and people are doing the right things with what we're learning. And absolutely, people can go on to any kind of TikTok or whatever and get mental health advice from people who know nothing about it at all. And there's risk there. So
I was just seeing a study that said 33% of the top however many TikTok channels and videos that deal with mental health are selling something that isn't true, that's not evidence-based, that could actually be harmful. A full 1/3 of the top videos that have been seen more than 1 billion times are misinformation of some kind,
Yeah. So that's the thing. If those of us in our field can take the risk to step outside of sort of the typical boundaries of our field, like publish in journals, right? Like if we can in our own ways, take a risk and step outside like the typical boundaries, what that's going to do is create really good, trusted sources of information for the general public. But we can't just sit back and do what we've always done. We have to meet the community where they're at, right? So, communities are not going into libraries and looking up journal articles.
Right.
What they're doing is, listening to podcasts, going on to social media, going on to YouTube. And what schools and children are doing still is getting books, right?
Right. And reading Goodnight Moon to your kids.
Right. And there's power in that, right? Like, there's power to write a best-selling children's book that is in every Canadian library, that is read to children over and over again. Like, there's such tremendous power in getting to have the ear of a child. And so if you have the honor and the privilege of having that ear of the child for 5 minutes, what are the best possible things that you could say to them? Right. That's something that I ask myself all the time. What would be the most helpful right now to be whispering into their ear?
And it strikes me that, obviously you can't put all of it into one book, which is why you have so many. This one, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looked to me like your previous children's books all had, my first discussion of divorce, or my first talk about the death of someone close to me, and those were the type of books. Was that one series, and then this one is something separate?
Yeah. So there's well, I started with the Just Enough series. And so that first series was designed to give just enough information, but not too much information around some key concepts. And that series included the death and the divorce books. I think there's 4 books in that series. But then what happened is that those books were wildly popular, and those readers, those little readers, were wanting more. And so I kind of did a variation on them, but for older children. So I wrote a book about tragedy, a book about prejudice, similar concepts, but made older. So now for kids up to like age, 12. The first series was kind of like capping out at about like grade 2. So like many preschools would have those books, but they were very popular in younger elementary ages. And then after those 2 series, which I guess were 9 books, I started to write for even younger children. So I've written 3 books, like board books for very younger children. And those books were around things like, the one was called Calm, which was kind of an instruction manual to the adult reading the book, actually. Like it was a book to be read to children, but it was about that concept of seeing and soothing. So like, how do we soothe a baby that is having a temper tantrum? So it was meant to be a book that you could pick up a child on your lap and read it. This particular book kind of propelled me back into the elementary years. But my next 2 books that are going to be following this book are geared again more towards the younger children. So 2 series and then one-off books, I guess, would be the other books outside of those series were not meant to be a series, but I can see how they're kind of shaping up to be a series, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, time will tell, I imagine. Now, you mentioned something, and this just occurred to me. When you're writing a book for someone who's very, very young, like a really, really young child, you're really not writing for them to read it themselves, right? You're writing for the parent to read it with the child or to the child. Does that change the way that you go about setting it up?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like for me, it's designed to be a subtle way of correcting parenting practices. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So my most recent book deal was on unconditional love. And so it's about sort of laying that foundation of no matter what the child does, you always love them. No matter what mistake they make, you always love them, and that you communicate that to them. And then, from a bigger perspective, of course, unconditional love in and of itself is a protective factor, but it also lays the foundation for like a growth mindset and being able to be comfortable with this learning curve of life and not always beat yourself up if you make mistakes. That's sort of that self-compassion piece that is absolutely the basis of many forms of depression and anxiety, social anxiety, right? So I'm writing these books to ensure that adults know how to interact with little ones, right?
Right. And so adults who are listening to this podcast now, maybe their child is having difficulty making friends in school, or maybe they are making friends, but the parent's a little concerned about how that's going. Who is the audience for this book? What parents would you suggest go out and pick up a copy of The Friendship Guide?
Thank you. So this book would be for parents of children probably up to about age 9, but it could also, in a fun way, be used for other conversations. It would be for anybody interacting with children at that age. So parents, grandparents, teachers. It would also be, I think, a really useful book to have in clinic offices. I'm a big believer of bibliotherapy. So, starting a therapy session with the child by reading a book and then building upon the ideas in the book in your session, I think is a very effective way of working with children. So I could see it be very, very well used in a counseling or clinical practice with children.
And I can see bibliotherapy being an excellent title for an evidence-based TikTok channel as well. Thanks so much to Dr. Jillian Roberts for joining me today. Links to her website, to Mindkey Health, and to the Friendship Guide can be found in today's show notes. And thanks to you for listening, streaming, downloading, and reviewing today's episode. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bohlman. Our editor and producer is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.